Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 10. From 1884 to 1918, the overview. The salient facts over this period were that, whilst women were yet to achieve the parliamentary vote at all, only about half of adult men had the vote either. This period, especially in its later half, was the era of the suffragette. Emmeline Pankhurst wrote, "It was in 1903 that we voted to call our new society the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. We resolved to limit our membership exclusively to women." The suffragettes, typified by the WSPU and led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, are the ones whom history has mostly remembered. They were the ones who indulged in what we would now call direct action, or even terrorism, including violence, bombing and arson. The prominence of the suffragettes in the public imagination has led to an incorrect understanding of this period, the final and most substantial stage in the winning of democracy. The suffragettes were neither the only campaigners for women's suffrage, nor even the most important. More important was the quieter politicking driven by many other suffragist organisations, of which Millicent Fawcett's NUWSS, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, was the largest and best known. Their importance will become especially clear when we reach the final chapter of the story, the period from 1911 to 1917. There is another manner in which the flamboyant suffragette activity has eclipsed key parts of the history. It has given the impression that there was no campaigning in this period on behalf of the disenfranchised working class men. This is completely untrue. By this time, working men increasingly had a mechanism for political representation through trades unions, the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party. These were all pursuing extension of the franchise to the working class, and working men were their first priority. Moreover, the Liberal Party was also strongly sympathetic, though individuals' opinions differed. The central questions which my review aims to address are: why was the 1918 Representation of the People Act passed during World War I? In what ways was the war itself a significant factor in the content of the Act? And was the main driver of the Act to extend the franchise to men or to extend the franchise to women? To quote Sean Lang, Parliamentary Reform 1785 to 1928, the standard version of the story of the fight for female suffrage sees it as a straight contest between the suffragettes and a chauvinistic male establishment, headed, not to say embodied, by the Prime Minister Asquith, and encompassing blinkered politicians, burly policemen and brutal prison warders. This traditional version has the merit of simplicity, with obvious heroes and villains, which makes it well suited to the general public. Unfortunately, it ignores some of the important paradoxes of the story. This is an understatement. Concentrating on the suffragette part of the story fails to acknowledge the bulk of the women's political story, and also fails to acknowledge that the women's vote was inextricably entwined with the issue of universal male suffrage. The principal paradox which I wish to expose is this. Before World War I, the main barrier to women being granted the vote was not the absence of support for the idea amongst male politicians. On the contrary, there was widespread support within the Liberal and Labour parties. Indeed, there was probably a majority in favour of some form of female enfranchisement in the House of Commons from 1884. Mrs. Pankhurst notes this herself in her autobiography. She writes, "In 1884, when the County Franchise Bill came before the country, we had an actual majority in favour of suffrage in the House of Commons. There were, in fact, a string of bills in the 2 decades prior to World War I proposing limited female suffrage in one form or another, many of which passed their second reading with strong majorities. This tends to get elided in the headlong rush to prove the oppression of a male hegemony." Mrs. Pankhurst was no fool. After earlier setbacks, she realised that it was the government, not Parliament, which was the barrier. Private members' bills were always vulnerable to derailing by the government. Pankhurst wrote, "Repeated experiences had taught us that the only way to attain women's suffrage was to commit a government to it. In other words, pledges of support from candidates were plainly useless. They were not worth having." Referring to the position in 1906, she reinforces the point thus: "For 7 years we had a majority in the House of Commons pledged to vote favourably on a suffrage bill. The year before they had voted favourably on one, yet that bill did not become law. Why? Because even an overwhelming majority of private members are powerless to enact law in the face of a hostile government of 11 cabinet ministers." But what Emmeline Pankhurst and many other suffragists failed to correctly diagnose was the reason for such resistance in passing bills, despite the apparent support in principle. At this point, it is crucial to be aware of the other branch of the suffrage movement, that which was primarily pursuing extending the franchise to the working class and preferably universal suffrage. The major tension within the suffrage movement at this time was caused by the differing opinions on whether to press for female suffrage in isolation from that of men, or to press for universal suffrage. This differing view was not unrelated to differing views on politics more generally. Hence, when Emmeline Pankhurst threw her own daughter Sylvia out of the WSPU, you may interpret that as an objection to Sylvia's socialism, or as an objection to Sylvia's insistence that the only valid goal was universal suffrage. Sylvia was to continue the campaign in her own East End-based organisation, the East London Federation.